Welcome back, guys. Good morning. What's up, etc., etc. Today, I'm trying to figure out where to mount some fluid coolers on the K-Swap 308. We've got a transmission cooler and an oil cooler that we need to find a home for. And so far, I've always imagined I'd put them in the front of the car. That's where they get the most airflow. That seems to be the most logical place to put them. But there are a couple of issues with that I don't really like. The biggest one being just the sheer amount of fluid volume I'd be relying on these pumps to push to send fluid all the way to the front of the car and then back to the back to do their job. Seems more complicated than it needs to be if I can find adequate airflow at the back of the car for them. So I've spent a couple of hours walking around the car trying to figure out how do I make adequate airflow work and where do I put these coolers? Because the obvious solution is to use something like these, or maybe the ducting that's in the actual hatch itself, or should I pick up air from underneath the car? What can I do here? How can I make this work? And after a few hours, honestly, I've come up with something. It's admittedly weird, but I'm pretty excited about it. I think it could look really cool, depending on how it's executed when it's done. And there's a bunch of reasons I like it. It'll require some interesting ducting. It'll require cutting up the back of the car, but we're this far in, why not go for it, right? So, point being, who needs a rear bumper? I don't need a rear bumper. Let's put oil coolers where a rear bumper would be. Let's do it. So this is the back of the 308, and this big black rectangle at the bottom is where the rear bumper used to be. Now, originally I planned on running a carbon fiber rear bumper for overall looks, but now that I've thought about it, I don't really need it. And although it'd be kind of odd, this could be a good place to mount an oil cooler. As mentioned, I originally planned on mounting the fluid coolers in the pockets where the headlights originally sat, since we're not going to be running pop-ups anymore. As mentioned though, there's a number of reasons I don't think this is the best solution to the problem at hand. And while it's probably fine to have a cooler this big for our oil system, it's definitely overkill for the transmission and differential. And routing the differential and transmission fluid all the way to the front of the car seems incredibly silly. So we're scrapping this idea up here and definitely moving to the back of the car. Ravi at CSF gave me two different coolers to try for the build. The first you just saw at the front of the car, but the second is this much smaller unit. We'll talk more about cooling capacity later in the episode, but I genuinely think this one's going to provide plenty of it. This thing is nice and compact, and it's got integrated mounting holes to make bracketry nice and low profile, because this thing just happens to be 308 bumper sized. After messing around, I realized it fit in the hole at the back of the car almost perfectly. And it would have been easy to just mount it the way you see it here, vertical up against the back of the car. However, I realized with just a little bit more work, I could angle the cooler and make it match the back angle of the car. The material's still behind it in this shot, but you can see I have it wedged into place, and you can get an idea of just how good this thing might look with a bit more finesse. So I went all in on removing material to make it fit. I started this process by removing material, and my aim was to only remove material from behind where the cooler would be, but leave everything else intact. So I used a hole saw to get myself close to the perimeter, but to give myself nice clean edges around what I was cutting out. If you're enjoying seeing a hole saw get run through the back end of a Ferrari, or you want to keep seeing more Sawzall on Ferrari action, do me a favor and subscribe, because that helps the channel grow and it makes the effort that goes into videos like these worthwhile. If you've ever cut a car apart like this, you know that it's always layer after layer and nothing ever goes quite as smoothly as you intend for it to. But thankfully the Sawzall made pretty quick work of everything at the back end, and what it didn't do, the die grinder did. Without too much work, I was able to cut a hole through the back end of the car and get an idea of where this oil cooler might fit. As you can see from the inside, there is quite a big hole in the back of this thing at this point, but I need more room. In order to fit this oil cooler, I've decided to cut out the rear hatch support bracket that surrounds the rear taillights. It's pretty important if you're going to run a normal latch, but because we're going to use hood pins on this thing, I'm not too worried about keeping it. And the support aspect of it, we can always add back in with some aluminum later. just finished cutting up kind of this side. I keep making this hole bigger and bigger as I go, as I kind of find more pieces that need to come out and kind of how everything sandwiches together, trying to make a nice looking hole back here. And you know how when you get a hangnail and you pull, you're like, oh, I'm just gonna pull that littlest piece off. And you start pulling it and it just turns into more and more. That's the back of this. I think I'm gonna cut the entire back out. I think I'm just gonna cut it all out and redo it, because the more I look at it, the more I realize I think that's what I need to do to be happy with it. It's more work in the long run, but otherwise I'm gonna be attaching new material to some of this like old crappy stuff. The construction's really weird. I think it might wind up limiting. I'll wind up still cutting a lot out, so it's gonna turn into this patchwork thing. I might as well just do it all. I don't know, maybe I'll regret this later. This is definitely the most like destructive feeling thing that I've done to the car, because like, why am I cutting just the back of the car out? But I think it'll be worth it. Or maybe it won't, we'll find out. It's the same story for the other side of the car. Lots of sawzall work, lots of die grinder work, and some angle grinder work in order to cut free a lot of this sheet metal. Now, a lot of you guys are definitely going to worry about cutting structure out of the car, but I'll remind you that this isn't a unibody vehicle. None of what I'm cutting out is important to the structure of the car. The structure itself is the tube chassis that's underneath it, so we're really just cutting out stuff that is, for the most part, aesthetic. If you're worried about the lack of a bumper and the crash safety aspect of it, the bumper on this thing wouldn't have done anything above 5 miles per hour. I'll take the risk. After a few hours of cutting, I had all of the material that I wanted to remove out of the car, and I'm pretty happy with the way that the whole thing has shaped up. It gives me a lot of access from outside the car to the inside, and it gives us a lot of airflow from one side of this panel to the other, which is what we are after. Obviously, we're going to need ducting to these fluid coolers at some point, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. There were some unfortunate mishaps while cutting out material, such as splitting the fiberglass from the floor of the car, which you can see in the crack that runs along the back here. But that turns out to be a blessing in disguise. It's going to help us fit the coolers even better once we are all said and done. But in a lot of this, you can see just how much room we have gained having cut everything out. You can also see just how much material we removed from the car by looking at the pile of parts on the floor. This stuff is mostly just sheet metal, although it does include some of the exhaust mounting points that I had not removed in the past. Out of curiosity, I weighed everything, and we've pulled another 19 pounds from the car. To mount the cooler, I drew up some brackets in CAD, as I always do, printed them out at a 1:1 scale, and then cut them out and put them on aluminum so that I could make these rather easily. The idea is to make brackets that can be part of the ducting for the coolers. If the brackets can wrap around and close in the face of the cooler, I can use them as part of the ductwork by connecting more material to them. After getting my parts cut out, I clamped them in the vise, got all of my holes drilled, and then folded the part up. I removed my template paper, which thankfully comes off rather easily thanks to the Elmer's glue stick, and then opened the holes up so that the M8 hardware will fit through the brackets and into the cooler itself. Unfortunately, there was a bit of an oversight while I was making my bracket, and in CAD I drew this thing with the outside dimensions of the cooler, not the inside. So the bracket was flush with the edges, but wouldn't fit over. So I had to go back to CAD and draw this thing over again. I'm on my fourth tiny revision on these brackets to make them fit the way that I want to. Finally got them working, and then I drove across town. Took me a half hour to go find some M8 button cap screws that are short enough so I can put these things in so it will fit in the back of the car, and I put it in, and it's not working the way that I want it to, and things are still at an odd angle. I'm kind of struggling with it. I'm not confident I'm going to be happy with this solution here, which sucks because I have spent all day trying to come up with this and then execute it, and man, I have been spinning my wheels all day long, and it's pretty frustrating. So I'm going to go back to the drawing board again and try to come up with something to mount a stupid oil cooler. I mean, I know I could just make some bent, ugly tab that would work, but I want something better than that, so. After a bit of brainstorming, I realized there was a way to modify the brackets that I had already made, saving me yet another revision on them and simplifying everything in the process. Unfortunately, it meant I had to abandon the idea of these brackets being part of the ducting, but in all, I think that's going to have to be just how it goes. You can see the cut brackets in place here, and it finally allowed me to get the cooler into the car. It might look like there's a lot of room to play with here, but there's not, and it means that these brackets have to be multiple pieces bolted together. Well, I've got this thing propped up very accurately with some precise measurement tools. We've got a pair of Worth notepads and a piece of tungsten to get these mounts sitting pretty close to flat on the table, which should orient this thing exactly how it is in the car. So I think if I do one side at a time, I can probably rebuild these to line up the way that I want. If I'm careful. This could spell disaster, but I'm not going to chop up the pieces that we have in case we need to go back and redo this. But that's the idea at hand at the moment, at least. I'm stumped otherwise. Hopefully we can make some brackets that actually look good. As mentioned, these won't fit into the car if they are all one piece, so I had to get creative with how this whole thing goes together. And as you can see by the pieces clamped together on the workbench, this looks a little bit like a patchwork quilt of aluminum, and I want to clean this whole thing up a bit. Now, if it's not apparent by what you've seen on screen already, the biggest challenge at hand is the fact that this cooler has to sit at an angle, and it has to sit at several angles. It needs to angle with the back of the car on its vertical axis and on the horizontal axis so that it can follow the very slight curvature that the back of the car has. The floor in the car that it's attaching to is not level, and the brackets are at different angles. So in all, this is a just complicated mess of parts that don't really want to go together. I know there's more than one way to solve this problem, but I think this one's going to work. So I took the parts and cleaned them up. And this is the final bracket result. There's still a little bit of finish work to do, but I think this is going to look pretty good in the back of the car. If somebody decides to lean in the back and take a look at what I've got going on, at least it's not outright embarrassing like some of the other solutions that I came up with. Now let's see what this cooler looks like fitted the way that it's supposed to be. There's still a little bit of touch-up work to do. I don't have the brackets fully bolted in yet, but I'm really happy with how this has come out. The cooler fits exactly like I had hoped that it would. The bracket fits in place. I think the ducting is going to work once I show you guys the idea that I have. In all, I think this was the right way to do this job. Now, I know some of you guys are going to wonder about the cooler size and the capacity. Will it be enough efficiency to keep everything cool? It's a fair question. I'm not worried about it, and those that I have talked to are not worried about it. Keep in mind, we're gonna have a huge oil capacity on this thing because it's dry sump. But if we can't keep it under control, I've got these. It's the same vertical dimension, they're just a lot wider. And since we cut the back of the car out, we can put these across the back end if we need to. I mocked it up, it looks cool. It's not as clean looking. It doesn't line up with the body lines like the little ones do, and I just don't think we need this. This is a lot more weight, but if we do need it, we've got it in our back pocket. With the cooler in place, I decided the rear end needed a little bit of something else in order to clean it up. Something to go between the cooler we just installed and the other one once we get it. So I got out some spare scrap material that I had lying around, and I think I'm going to make a filler piece to go between the two. I'm just going to throw something together for this episode as a proof of concept. I can't imagine anything we make today will be a final piece, but I want to see if I'm going down the right path. I bent up a lot of test pieces before finally landing on the right set of bends and angles, and then I bent a piece up for us to use. I then made a handful of measurements and cut the thing so that I can put some slight bends in it to match the curvature of the back of the car that I mentioned earlier. Otherwise, this thing will not fit whatsoever. My stomp shear in the back of the shop made really quick work of all this aluminum and made building this thing nice and easy, really quick. In fact, the whole thing only took maybe an hour in total. The perforated aluminum that I'm using was left behind at the shop from a previous swamp cooler install on the roof from a previous tenant, So it finally came in handy, and I'm glad I've held on to it for all of these years. And the idea at hand is to give it a bit of a feel like a 360 Challenge car, a screen to see through the back and maybe give you a peek of the turbo or the engine. I might even tuck a third brake light behind this so that it glows when I apply the brakes. I used my rivet gun, which I've showed you guys before, in order to assemble this whole thing, and while I know most people don't need one of these, it makes quick work of this. I highly recommend one if you like rivets. I threw the bottom trim piece on and then used some zip ties to hold the whole thing in place, and here's the outcome. Now, in raw aluminum, it definitely stands out, but I think in black, this thing will look pretty sweet. It will kind of blend in with the coolers. It will look like a bumper from far away, and as said, I think it should give a pretty cool view of the turbocharger that hangs down below the back of the car. It's a little bit like a 935, which is one of my favorite cars of all time. There's definitely room for revision on all counts here, but as a whole, I'm really happy with my decision to cut the back of the car out, and I think this whole setup is going to look amazing when finished. Honestly, getting that cooler mounted was a much bigger challenge than I thought it would be. I figured it'd be a couple of tabs and just be done with it inside of an hour, and it just didn't go that way at all. All of the different axes that I had to kind of make sure that it was true to, and none of it lined up with anything else. It was a pretty big challenge. I kind of struggled with it. I think the solution that I have for it, it definitely works. Is it the best? It's probably not, but I'm happy with it, and it's in there, and we can copy it and mirror it for the other side once we get the other cooler, which should be by the end of the week. I don't think we will have it for Thursday's episode, but maybe we'll get lucky. But in Thursday's episode, we will be ducting the coolers. I've got some parts that should arrive today, so we can get started on that. And I think we're gonna do some more sheet metal work in the back, kind of add some structure in for what we cut out. Should be pretty cool. Lots of kind of nice shaped aluminum, some dimple dies, all that kind of stuff. And I might revise our kind of bumper trim piece that we put in there. I think it's a good proof of concept. It needs some tweaking, maybe a little bit of a redesign, but I like the way that it looks, and I think it's a cool idea. I think there's something we can build upon with that. I'm into it. So hopefully Thursday's episode will have quite a bit of fabrication. I'm pretty pumped on it. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this episode. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I will catch you on Thursday.